The first time I realized something was wrong, there was no dramatic confession, no suspicious photograph, and no message that clearly exposed a betrayal. It was something much smaller. My husband, Daniel, had started protecting his phone. We had been together for 6 years, married for 4. In the beginning, Daniel was the kind of person who would leave his phone anywhere. On the kitchen counter, beside the bed, in the car. He never seemed to care who picked it up because there had never been a reason to hide anything. Then, almost overnight, that changed. He began carrying it from room to room. If he showered, the phone went with him. If he went downstairs for a glass of water, it was in his hand. Even during dinner, when he used to complain about people being distracted by their screens, he kept his own device face down beside his plate. I noticed, but I didn't accuse him. I told myself there were innocent explanations. Maybe work had become stressful. Maybe someone was bothering him. Maybe he was planning a surprise. Maybe I was simply overthinking everything. That last possibility became my favorite excuse. Daniel had always been good at making ordinary things sound convincing. When I asked why he suddenly needed his phone beside him all the time, he smiled and said, "Nothing serious. Work has been crazy." I believed him. At least, I wanted to. The real change wasn't his phone. It was him. He stopped asking about my day. He stopped telling me little things that used to matter. Our conversations became practical. Bills, groceries, dinner, work, sleep. The man who once remembered tiny details about me suddenly seemed unable to remember what I had told him 5 minutes earlier. One Friday evening, I cooked his favorite meal. I had spent almost an hour preparing everything because I thought we could finally have a quiet night together. I expected him home at 7. He arrived nearly 2 hours late. When I asked where he had been, he hesitated. Only for a second. But that second stayed with me. "Traffic," he said. I looked at him. There was nothing obviously wrong. His clothes were normal. His expression was calm. His explanation was believable. Still, something inside me refused to accept it. I didn't argue. I simply said, "Okay." He sat down, picked up his phone, and started typing. I watched his face change. He smiled. Not the polite smile he had been giving me lately. A real smile. It disappeared almost immediately when he noticed me looking. "Who was that?" I asked. "Just someone from work." He locked the phone. That was when I understood that I wasn't imagining the distance between us. There was someone or something occupying a space in his life that he no longer wanted me to see. I didn't know the truth yet. I didn't know how long it had been happening. And I certainly didn't know that the answer I was about to discover would change the way I remembered our entire marriage. That night, while Daniel slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling and made myself one promise. I wouldn't accuse him without knowing the truth, but I would find out what he was hiding. For the next few days, I tried to act normal. That became harder every morning. Once you know something is wrong, ordinary moments stop feeling ordinary. A simple notification can sound like a warning. A short phone call can feel like evidence. Even a change in someone's tone can make you question everything you thought you understood. I didn't want to become suspicious of every little thing Daniel did, so I forced myself to focus on facts. And the facts were getting harder to ignore. He had started coming home later. He stopped making plans with me. He suddenly had more work meetings, more private calls, and more reasons to step outside whenever his phone rang. One afternoon, I asked him directly if everything was okay between us. He looked surprised. "Of course it is." "Then why does it feel different?" He stared at me for a moment before answering. "You've been stressed lately. You're reading too much into things." That answer hurt more than I expected. Not because he had admitted anything, because he made me question myself. I began wondering whether I was actually becoming paranoid. Maybe our marriage was simply going through a difficult period. Maybe Daniel was exhausted. Maybe I was expecting too much from him. So I tried harder. I planned dinner. I suggested we go out on the weekend. I asked about his work. I even brought up old memories that normally made him laugh. He responded politely. But politeness wasn't what I wanted. I wanted my husband back. Then something happened that changed everything. Daniel received a message while we were sitting together. His phone was on the table. He looked at the screen, and his expression immediately changed. He picked it up so quickly that it almost seemed automatic. I didn't see the entire message. I only caught a few words before the screen disappeared. Last night. Then another notification appeared. This time, Daniel didn't even look at me. He stood up and walked into another room. I sat there completely still. I didn't follow him. I didn't demand to see the phone. Instead, I waited. When he returned, I asked, "Who keeps messaging you?"
He sighed.
"Why are you doing this again?" "Doing what?" "Interrogating me." I stared at him. I asked one question. He shook his head and walked away. That was the first time I realized that his anger wasn't really about my question. It was about being questioned at all. The following morning, I noticed something else. Daniel had changed the password on his phone. I knew because he had once told me the password without hesitation. Now, when he opened it, he deliberately turned the screen away. That small gesture felt louder than any confession. Still, I refused to invade his privacy. I didn't want to become someone I didn't recognize. Instead, I decided to watch what he did when he thought I wasn't paying attention. Over the next week, I noticed a pattern. Whenever a particular notification appeared, he became more careful. Sometimes he smiled. Sometimes he immediately left the room. Once, I heard him laughing quietly during a late-night phone call. When I walked toward him, the conversation ended. He later claimed it was a coworker. But there was something about his voice that bothered me. It wasn't the voice of a man discussing work. It was relaxed, familiar, comfortable. The kind of voice people use when they're talking to someone they genuinely enjoy hearing from. That night, I finally stopped asking myself whether something was wrong. Something was wrong. The only question left was how serious it was. I didn't know who the other person was. I didn't know what Daniel had been saying. But I knew the distance between us wasn't accidental anymore. And then, on Saturday morning, Daniel made a mistake. He left his phone charging on the kitchen counter and walked outside to take a call. For the first time in weeks, the screen lit up while I was standing nearby. I didn't touch it. I didn't open anything. I simply saw the name appear. It wasn't a coworker. It wasn't a colleague. It was a name I recognized immediately. A woman Daniel had once told me was just an old friend. I felt my stomach drop. And suddenly, every unexplained late night, every hidden message, every interrupted conversation seemed to point toward the same painful possibility. The truth was no longer somewhere in the distance. It was sitting right in front of me. And I was about to discover that Daniel had been lying about far more than a few messages. I knew her name before I knew the truth. That was the part that frightened me most. Her name was Emily. Daniel had mentioned her months earlier when we were talking about people from his past. He had described her as an old friend from work, someone he occasionally heard from. Nothing about the conversation had seemed important at the time. Now, seeing her name appear on his phone felt completely different. I stepped away from the counter before Daniel came back inside. I didn't want him to know what I had seen. Not yet. For the rest of the morning, I said nothing. Daniel behaved normally. He made coffee, checked his messages, and talked about plans for the following week as though our marriage were perfectly fine. I listened carefully. There was no nervousness in his voice. That almost made it worse. Later that afternoon, I finally asked him about Emily. His reaction answered more than his words did. He froze. Only briefly, but I noticed. "Why are you asking about her?" "Because I remembered you mentioned her before." He looked away. "She messaged me recently. That's all." "What does she want?" "Nothing." The answer came too quickly. I waited. Daniel sighed. "She's going through some personal problems. I was just checking on her." I nodded. That explanation might have worked if I hadn't already noticed everything else. "How long have you been talking to her?" He became defensive immediately. "Why does it matter?" "Because you're my husband." He stared at me. Then he said something I will never forget. "You're making this into something it isn't." That sentence stayed with me because it wasn't a denial. He didn't say, "There is nothing between us." He didn't say, "You have nothing to worry about." He simply told me I was wrong for asking. That evening, I stopped trying to convince myself that everything was normal. I began looking at the situation differently. The question was no longer whether Daniel had betrayed me. The question was how much of the truth he was willing to admit. A few days later, another message appeared. This time, I was sitting across from him. Daniel looked at the screen and immediately locked his phone. I didn't ask who it was. Instead, I said quietly, "If there is something I need to know, tell me now." He looked at me for several seconds. Then he said, "There isn't." I believed one thing in that moment. He was still lying. So I asked the question I had been afraid to ask. "Have you been seeing Emily?"
His face changed.
He didn't answer. That silence was enough. I felt my heart sink, but I stayed calm. "How long?" Daniel rubbed his forehead. It wasn't supposed to become anything. Those words were worse than a confession, because they meant there had already been something. I asked him when it started. He said they had become close several months earlier. At first, according to him, they had only talked. Then the conversations became more frequent. Then they began meeting without telling me. He insisted that he had never planned to hurt me. I almost laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because I couldn't understand how someone could repeatedly hide something and still claim they hadn't planned to cause pain. I asked him why he had chosen secrecy. He had no convincing answer. He said he was confused. He said he felt understood by her. He said our marriage had become distant. I listened until he finished. Then I asked the question that mattered most. "If you were unhappy, why didn't you tell me?" Daniel looked down. "I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Losing you." That answer broke something inside me. Because he had been so afraid of losing me that he had done exactly what could make him lose me forever. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I didn't beg him to stay. I simply told him that trust wasn't destroyed in one moment. It had been damaged every time he looked me in the eyes and chose another lie. Daniel tried to explain himself again, but I stopped him. "I don't need another explanation tonight." For the first time, he seemed to understand that this wasn't an argument he could win. It was a consequence he had created. But there was still one thing I didn't know. And when I asked about it, Daniel's expression changed again. "Is that everything?" I said. He hesitated. That hesitation told me the truth was still incomplete. "There is something else," he finally admitted. And whatever he was about to tell me would change the entire story. There was something else. I waited for Daniel to speak. He looked exhausted, as if he had spent months carrying a secret and had finally realized there was nowhere left to hide it. "The relationship started before you thought it did," he said. I felt strangely calm. "How long?" He gave me a date. It was almost a year earlier. That meant nearly everything I had believed about the last year of our marriage was wrong. The late nights. The unexplained absences. The sudden distance. The promises that nothing had changed. All of it had been happening while I was still trying to repair a relationship he had already begun abandoning. But then he told me the part one hadn't expected. Emily wasn't the only person he had been talking to. Before her, there had been someone else. I stared at him, trying to understand how one confession could become another. He explained that the first situation had ended months earlier. Emily had entered his life afterward. He insisted that he had never intended for either relationship to become serious. But that explanation didn't matter anymore. The pattern mattered. Whenever our marriage became difficult, Daniel had chosen secrecy instead of honesty. He had looked outside our relationship instead of confronting the problems inside it. And each time, he had convinced himself that keeping the truth hidden was easier than facing the consequences. I finally understood something important. The betrayal wasn't just about another person. It was about every decision Daniel had made before I ever discovered the truth. I asked him whether he still wanted our marriage. He didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "I don't know." That was the most honest thing he had said all night. And strangely, it gave me clarity. For months, I had been afraid of losing him. Now I realized I had been holding on to a version of him that no longer existed. I told him I needed space. He asked if that meant our marriage was over. I said I didn't know. But I knew one thing. I couldn't pretend nothing had happened. The next few weeks were difficult. Daniel wanted forgiveness quickly. He apologized often. He promised to change. He said he understood how badly he had hurt me. But forgiveness isn't something another person can demand simply because they finally told the truth. I needed time to decide whether trust could ever be rebuilt. And more importantly, I needed to decide whether I even wanted to rebuild it. I started spending time away from the relationship and began thinking about myself again. I remembered the person I had been before every conversation became an attempt to keep someone else happy. I remembered how confidently I used to make decisions. I realized that Daniel's betrayal had made me question my instincts. But my instincts had been right. I wasn't paranoid. I wasn't imagining things. I had noticed the distance because the distance was real. Eventually, Daniel asked me for another chance. I told him that a second chance wasn't the same as pretending the first betrayal never happened. If we were ever going to move forward, everything would have to change. There would have to be honesty, accountability, patience, and a willingness to accept that I might never trust him the way I once did. He agreed.
But I still didn't promise to stay.
That was the biggest lesson I learned. Loving someone doesn't mean you have to accept being treated carelessly. And leaving doesn't always mean you stopped loving them. Sometimes, it means you finally started valuing yourself. Months later, I made my decision. I chose to leave the marriage. It wasn't because I hated Daniel. It was because I couldn't build a peaceful future on top of a foundation that had been repeatedly broken. Daniel apologized one final time. I accepted the apology. But acceptance wasn't reconciliation. I walked away carrying sadness, disappointment, and a strange sense of relief. For a long time, I believed betrayal was about the person who entered the relationship. I was wrong. Betrayal is about the choices made by the person who promised to protect your trust. Daniel made his choices. Eventually, I had to make mine. And my choice was simple. I would rather face the pain of starting over than spend the rest of my life wondering whether the person beside me was telling me the truth. The hardest part wasn't losing my marriage. It was realizing that I had spent so much time trying to save something that the other person had already stopped protecting. But once I accepted that, I finally understood something I should have known from the beginning. Trust can be broken in seconds, but your self-respect doesn't have to break with it.